There is a very famous story by the American author Mark Twain called The Prince and the Pauper. In this story, a prince invites a poor beggar into his castle, and for fun, the two exchange clothes. As the story goes, the beggar, being mistaken for the prince, is kept in the castle and lives the life of a prince. But unfortunately, the prince is mistaken for the beggar and is thrown out of the castle. Now, had the prince known that he would be thrown out of the castle, I'm sure he never would have agreed to change clothes with the beggar. Dabbling in such simple fun could never be worth losing so much. In some ways, the situation in Colossae during the first century resembled the story of the prince and the pauper. The Christians in Colossae were being tempted to exchange their great privileges in Christ for the practice of pagan forms of worship. So Paul wrote an epistle to remind the Colossians of the tremendous riches and royal privileges they enjoyed in Christ, and to warn them of the serious consequences of trading these blessings for the meager benefits that idolatry pretended to offer. This is the second lesson in our series, Paul's Prison Epistles, and we have entitled this lesson, Paul and the Colossians. In this lesson, we will be studying Paul's canonical letter to the Colossians. As we will see, in this letter, Paul responded strongly to heretical teachings that introduced the veneration of lesser spiritual beings into Christian worship. Our study of Paul and the Colossians will divide into three parts. First, we will explore the background of Paul's letter to the Colossians. Second, we'll investigate the structure and content of his letter to the Colossians. And third, we will focus on the modern application of this letter. Let's turn first to the background to Paul's letter to the Colossians. Paul was an apostle of Jesus Christ, and writing letters was an aspect of his authoritative ministry as Christ's representative. Another part of being an apostle was pastoring churches and individuals. And so, Paul's letters were not just collections of authoritative teaching. Rather, they were personal and pastoral, motivated by love and concern for the churches and people to whom he wrote. And Paul's letters were also occasional. That is, they were written to address specific issues in particular times and places. So as we study Paul's letter to the Colossians, it is important for us to know something about the occasion that prompted Paul's writing. We have to ask questions like, what problems did the Colossians face? What motivated Paul to write to them? We'll approach the background to Paul's letter to the Colossians from two directions. First, we'll mention some details of his relationships with the Colossian church in general, and with individuals within the church. And second, we'll investigate some of the problems in Colossae that concerned Paul. Let's begin by looking at Paul's relationships with the Colossians. Paul did not have the same relationship with every Colossian Christian, so we will focus first on his relationship with the church in general, and then on his relationship with specific individuals. Let's turn first to his relationship with the church in Colossae. The city of Colossae was located in the Roman province of Asia, in a region called Phrygia. It lay in the Lycus Valley, a bit to the east of the larger and more popular city of Laodicea. Colossae was relatively small, and by the political and economic standards of the day, it was certainly the least important city to receive any of Paul's canonical letters. Paul had never actually visited the church in Colossae, but he cared deeply for them nonetheless. Listen to his words in Colossians chapter 2, verse 1. I want you to know how much I am struggling for you and for those at Laodicea, and for all who have not met me personally. Now, Paul had traveled through Phrygia during his second and third missionary journeys, but for some reason he had not visited the Colossian church. Possibly he had been to Colossae prior to the establishment of the church there, or perhaps he had visited the city but not had the opportunity to meet the church. It is also possible that he had never even visited the city of Colossae. Whatever the case, Paul did not know most of these believers personally. Nevertheless, we are able to learn some things about Paul's relationship with the Colossians from the details in Paul's letter to them, as well as from his letter to Philemon, who lived in Colossae. For one thing, we read that Paul had an indirect relationship with the Colossians through representatives, such as his Colossian friends Epaphras, Philemon and Onesimus, and his messenger Tychicus. Second, although they had not met face to face, Paul and the Colossians corresponded with each other. For instance, Epaphras had brought reports of the Colossians to Paul, and Paul sent at least one letter to the church in Colossae, namely the New Testament epistle to the Colossians. Third, Paul and the Colossians ministered to each other. For instance, besides struggling in prison on their behalf, Paul prayed specifically for the Colossians. As he wrote in Colossians chapter 1, verse 9, "Since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you and asking God to fill you with the knowledge of His will through all spiritual wisdom and understanding." Paul regularly prayed specifically for the Colossians, asking for the blessings he knew would most benefit them. The Colossians ministered to Paul as well. We learn from Paul's letter to the Colossians and to Philemon that the Colossian men Epaphras and Onesimus visited Paul in prison. And since the Colossian church sent messengers to Paul, it is reasonable to assume that they prayed for him too. In short, even though Paul had not personally met most of the Colossian believers, they shared affection and affinity for one another, making their relationship real and substantial. Having seen the nature of Paul's relationship with the church in Colossae, we should look at his relationship with specific individuals within the Colossian church with whom he was more familiar. Paul had a number of friends from Colossae. These were not just people with whom he was acquainted, but personal friends, many of whom had labored alongside Paul in gospel ministry. 3 such friends were Philemon, Apphia, and Archippus. Listen to Paul's words in Philemon verses 1 and 2, which form the salutation to that letter. To Philemon, our dear friend and fellow worker, to Apphia, our sister, to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church that meets in your home. Philemon, at least, was a close friend of Paul, and Paul's mention of Apphia would seem to indicate that he knew her as well. Many scholars believe that she was a member of Philemon's household, probably his wife. Since Archippus was a person of status within the church, Paul's address to him might be honorary, but it is more likely that he was also part of Philemon's family, perhaps his son. Another of Paul's friends from Colossae was Epaphras. Paul referred to Epaphras as his fellow worker and fellow prisoner, and mentioned that Epaphras was a faithful minister of Christ. Epaphras remained with Paul in prison when Paul sent his letter to the Colossian church. Paul's friend Onesimus was also from Colossae. Onesimus was a slave who appears to have sought out Paul after fleeing from Philemon, and who ended up ministering to Paul in prison. Most of Paul's friends seem to have been associated in some way with Philemon. But whatever their relationships to one another, it is clear that Paul had closer relationships with these friends than he had with the church in Colossae in general. But as his letter to the Colossians shows, it is also clear that his relationships with these friends increased his love for all the believers in Colossae. So then, generally speaking, Paul had a fairly minimal personal relationship with the Colossian church. But he also cared deeply and personally for several of its members. He had strong feelings for their church, not only because he was an apostle, but also because of its association with his friends. Having examined Paul's relationships with the Colossians in general and with particular individual Colossians, we are ready to investigate the problems in Colossae that concerned Paul. What difficulties did they face? What prompted Paul to write to them? While Paul was in prison, he was visited by a man named Epaphras, who was from the city of Colossae. And Epaphras told Paul about some false teachings that were threatening the churches of the Lycus Valley, including the church in Colossae. So in order to defend the church against this false teaching, Paul wrote his letter to the Colossians. Although we do not know all the details of the false teaching in Colossae, Paul's letter tells us several things about it. First, the false teaching in Colossae seems to have mixed Christianity with elements of Greek philosophy. Second, it depended heavily on Jewish law. And third, it insisted that there were many spiritual beings that Christians were required to venerate and to appease. Let's look first at the aspects of this teaching that related to Greek philosophy. In the first century Mediterranean world, there was no sharp distinction between religious speculations on the one hand and intellectual study on the other hand. And as a result, the word philosophy was typically applied to occult religions, especially those that were based on religious traditions. Often, these traditions involved special mysteries and rites, as well as secret knowledge and wisdom. Sadly, some of these occult philosophies were finding their way into the church at Colossae. We can see Paul's concern over this in Colossians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. I am struggling for you in order that you may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, so that no one may deceive you by fine-sounding arguments. Paul's words here indicate that the Colossians valued mystery, wisdom, and knowledge, all of which Greek philosophy and religion typically valued. So in response to the claims of the false teachers in Colossae, Paul emphasized that true mystery, wisdom, and knowledge were found only in Christ and not in pagan religion. Then in Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, Paul explicitly identified pagan philosophy as his target and condemned it in no uncertain terms. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. Here, Paul directly labeled the false teaching hollow and deceptive philosophy. As we have seen in typical Greek usage, the word philosophy referred to religious speculations based on traditions, not to purely intellectual or rational study. These verses strongly suggest that the false teachers in Colossae were enamored with beliefs and practices based in Greek religion and occult mysticism. To gain acceptance in the church, they probably embraced some elements of Christianity, but they clearly did not embrace Christianity as it was taught by the apostles, or else they would not have relied on occult tradition as the basis of their system. The pagan philosophy advocated by the false teachers in Colossae also seems to have included elements of asceticism. Asceticism is an improper avoidance of physical pleasure. It is often rooted in the mistaken idea that pleasure is immoral, and it sometimes goes so far as to advocate inflicting physical pain on oneself. Paul denounced such asceticism in Colossians chapter 2, verses 20 through 23. Since you died with Christ to the basic principles of this world, why do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom, with their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. Paul objected to the ascetic practices in Colossae for at least two reasons. First, their asceticism was based on the basic principles of the world. As we will see later in this lesson, this language refers to spiritual beings and angelic powers. Second, it was of no value in resisting sin and thus provided no benefits. In summary, then, the false teachers in Colossae tried to mix the church's teachings with Greek traditions that were supposed to bring wisdom and strengthen believers against temptation. But in reality, the wisdom they offered was false, their practices were worthless, and their teachings denied the supremacy of Christ. In addition to promoting Greek philosophy, the false teachers in Colossae incorporated many practices based on Jewish law. However, their use and understanding of Jewish law departed both from traditional Judaism and from proper Christian practices. As we have seen in other lessons, Paul upheld the Mosaic law, and he was willing to accept and participate in many traditional Jewish practices for the sake of the gospel. So if the false teachers in Colossae had employed the law in a valid way, Paul would not have criticized their use of it. His criticisms indicate that the false teachers were using Jewish teachings and practices in corrupt ways. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, Paul referred to a number of Jewish practices that the false teachers abused when he wrote, "Do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day." Evidently, the false teachers in Colossae stressed certain practices derived from the Old Testament law. These included observances of the Jewish calendar, such as religious festivals, new moon celebrations, and the Sabbath day, as well as dietary restrictions. But they did not observe these Old Testament regulations in the way prescribed by the Mosaic law, nor did they apply them in the way that the apostles did. On the contrary, Paul declared that their practices distorted Old Testament law and endangered the eternal destinies of those who followed them. As he wrote in Colossians chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, "These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you for the prize." The Mosaic law did not associate holy days with the worship of angels, but with the worship of God. And it did not advocate a special diet as a means of humility or asceticism, but as a sign of being set apart as God's special people. The false teachers, however, had corrupted these laws, using them in idolatrous worship and pagan asceticism. In Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, Paul added circumcision to the list of Jewish laws the false teachers abused. "In him you were also circumcised, not with the circumcision done by the hands of men, but with the circumcision done by Christ, having been buried with him in baptism." Apparently, the false teachers in Colossae were advocating a form of Christian circumcision. So Paul associated circumcision and Christian baptism in order to teach the Colossians that because they had been baptized, they did not need to be circumcised. In short, in Colossians, Paul wrote against abuses of the Mosaic law. He did not write against the law itself. Elsewhere, Paul affirmed that the law of Moses is a proper basis for Christian morality and practice, and that it teaches us many true things about God. But here in Colossians, he concentrated on refuting the specific teachings and practices of the false teachers. condemning the ways that they had corrupted particular statutes in the law and insisting that the church reject these corruptions. Besides employing Greek philosophy and adopting practices based on Jewish law, the false teachers in Colossae promoted the worship of spiritual beings, encouraging Christians to venerate and appease these powers. That the Colossian church was courting the worship of spiritual powers is evident in at least three ways. First, Paul wrote of the worship of angels. Second, he addressed the matter of rulers and authorities. And third, he dealt with problems related to the basic principles of this world. We should begin by looking at his mention of angel worship. According to the Bible, angels are God's servants, and they have always played a role in creation. God delegates many jobs to them, from spiritual warfare to influencing national politics, to delivering messages to his people, to caring for the earthly needs of believers. And the early church was well aware of these roles. As we read in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, "Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation?" Angels really are ministering spirits, and it is important to recognize their work. But according to the false teachers in Colossae, angels were much more than ministers. They were cosmic powers, oracles that revealed mysterious teachings to those who would perform their cultic rites and worship them. Paul directly condemned these practices in Colossians chapter 2, verse 18, where he wrote, "Do not let anyone who delights in the worship of angels disqualify you for the prize. Such a person goes into great detail about what he has seen, and his unspiritual mind puffs him up with idle notions." The false teachers claim to have received visions from angels, and on this basis they encouraged other Christians to complete the proper rituals so that they might receive similar visions. And perhaps the false teachers really had experienced visions, though these would have been from demons rather than from God's holy angels. Alternatively, they may simply have experienced self-induced or even drug-induced ecstatic trances, or they might even have been lying. Whatever the case, this exaggerated view of the power and influence of angels was not uncommon in the ancient world. Some Jewish teachers maintained comparable ideas about angels, and some Greek philosophies taught similar things about their oracles and astral powers. Sadly, the familiarity of these ideas to the Colossian Christians probably made the false teachings sound reasonable, allowing these false doctrines to gain a foothold in the Colossian church. Now that we have looked at Paul's direct references to the worship of angels, we should turn to his discussion of rulers and authorities. In the language of the first century, the terms rulers and authorities referred to spiritual beings such as angels. As we have seen, the false teachers in Colossae encouraged believers to worship angels and spiritual beings. Paul responded to this heresy by emphasizing Christ's superiority over every power and authority in heaven and on earth. He wrote of Jesus' supremacy in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. "For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him." Here, Paul mentioned thrones, powers, rulers, and authorities. Thrones and powers translate forms of the Greek words thronos and kuriates. Both these words commonly refer to human kings and other earthly rulers, but they could also refer to spiritual beings. Rulers and authorities, in turn, translate forms of the Greek words arche and exousia, words that usually refer to invisible spiritual powers such as angels and demons. In the worldview of the false teachers in Colossae, the angelic and demonic spiritual authorities were significantly greater than their earthly human counterparts. The false teachers greatly exaggerated the power of angels and demons, so much so that they attributed to these invisible rulers actions and abilities that in reality belong to Christ alone. Paul pointed out their error by praising Christ as the Lord of all creation. Rather than distinguishing between the spiritual and earthly authorities, Paul treated them as one, indicating that the spiritual and the earthly were far more similar than they were different. They were both created, and both were inferior to Christ. The real contrast to be drawn was not of the spiritual over the earthly, as the false teachers insisted, but of Christ over all. Again, as he said in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, "For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth." Paul went on to say that the spiritual forces and Christ were in direct conflict. The false teachers thought that worshiping Christ was compatible with worshiping spiritual authorities. But Paul indicated that regardless of how the false teachers envisioned the spiritual beings they worshiped, the truth was that only demons allowed themselves to be worshiped. God's holy angels have no part in such idolatry, and Christ does not permit the worship of his enemies. Paul addressed this point in Colossians chapter 2, verse 15, where he wrote, "Having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross." Through the cross of Jesus Christ, God disarmed and triumphed over the spiritual powers and authorities. In other words, the spiritual powers and authorities opposed God in spiritual war. They were rebellious, evil spirits, enemies of God. They were demons, not holy angels. But through Jesus Christ, God had stripped these demons of their ability to fight and had humiliated them in defeat. These fallen, powerless, defeated demons were the spiritual powers worshipped by the false teachers in Colossae, the ones to which Paul referred as rulers and authorities. Now that we have explored Paul's mention of angels and of spiritual rulers and authorities, we are in a position to see how Paul spoke of the basic principles of this world. As we have already said, this was yet another phrase that referred to spiritual beings. In the first century, the Greek term stoicheia, which may be translated basic principles, commonly referred to the gods and spiritual powers that were associated with the stars and planets. Stoicheia was also used to refer to the four basic physical elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. These basic principles or elements were thought to influence and even control the fates of men and women. Paul clearly used stoicheia in this way in Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, where he wrote, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. How is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable principles?" Here the word principles translates the Greek word stoicheia, and it refers to those who by nature are not gods. That is, it refers to the demons that masquerade as pagan gods. This same meaning of stoicheia is also the one Paul intended in Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, where he condemned these basic principles. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. Paul pointed to the basic principles, or stoicheia, as the basis for the philosophy of the false teachers. In other words, he was arguing that the religious traditions of the false teachers should be rejected because they appealed to false gods. Interestingly, similar ideas about the elements and spiritual powers were held by some branches of Judaism, especially during the intertestamental period. This seems to have set the stage for the Christian heresy that appeared in Colossae in Paul's day. The false teachers in Colossae appear to have combined Jewish legalism, pagan religion, and Christianity, and to have encouraged the worship of these astral or cosmic powers, commonly known as basic principles, or stoicheia. The church in Colossae faced some real challenges in the first century. Unlike other churches, they had apparently never received apostolic training. Although the church had been planted by godly men, it had not been solidly grounded in the theology of the apostles. This made the Colossian Christians particularly vulnerable to false teaching. So when false teachers began to bombard them with corruptions of Judaism and pagan idolatry, it was hard for them to tell the difference between truth and heresy. Wisely, they recognized their problem and appealed to Paul for help.